Hello, I'm Dr. Ron Charles. Welcome to the program today. The Sermon on the Mount has been considered to be one of the top teaching lessons that have ever been spoken by mankind. It has a little bit of everything, and it has something for everyone, especially if you consider yourself a disciple of Jesus, a 21st century disciple, because this was given to his disciples. At this time, there were only 6, and they were just beginning to accompany Jesus on his ministry. They were going to be his associates to help crowd control, to help to talk to people and to bring them to Jesus and various other things. So Jesus wanted them to know what is coming and how they should act and react and what type of attitude they should have and so forth. And so this Sermon on the Mount was an instruction tool given to them before they went out to accompany him in ministry. And one of the first things that he taught them, we see in Matthew, the 5th chapter. In Matthew, the 5th chapter, we're going to begin to read at verse number 13, as Jesus is talking to his disciples. And this Sermon on the Mount was not given to the multitudes. It was given to his disciples. Okay? The multitudes still stayed down at the bottom of the hill. Verse number 13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is therefore good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden underfoot of men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father is in heaven." The salt of the earth. Now, at this time, salt was by far the most precious thing sought after by the Roman government. It was more precious than gold, more precious than silver. But the beginning of this preciousness dates back about 350 years before this to Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great had a tremendous Macedonian army, and he conquered everything that he wanted to conquer and to do everything he wanted to do. Now, while he was fighting in Greece, when fighting in Macedonia and Trance, so there was no problems as far as his soldiers were concerned to get supplies and to get meat. Alexander discovered out of experience that if his soldiers, if his army had meat the night before a battle, then they would be more sustainable. They would have more strength. They would have more energy. The fight would last longer at a high level of activity. And so, while he was in Greece and in Macedonia, there was no problem. Meat was readily available. But once his army passed the Bosphorus and invaded the Persian Empire, which present-day Turkey, then things got a little bit out of balance because meat was not readily available. That desert area could not sustain the type of meat that was necessary to feed his army. And although he continued to win battles, his army began to lose its members because they didn't have the energy, and they would be cut down and have to be sent back to the back with injuries that they would not have had if they had the strength and the stamina to withstand the attacks. Strictly by accident, Alexander learned a lesson of preservation of meat. One of his generals was out hunting one day in the region of western Turkey. He killed a couple of rabbits, and as he was taking these back to have them dressed and fixed for his meal that night, it began to rain, and he ran into a cave that was near where he was hunting to escape the rain. And shortly after he entered into the cave, he went ahead and said, well, I'm going to build a fire and I'm going to cook these rabbits now. So he skinned them and prepared them to cook. But just as he lit the fire and just as he had begun to cook these rabbits that he had killed, a messenger came and told him that Alexander needs him right now. You cannot wait. You must come. So he took the meat and he put out the fire and threw the rabbits over in the corner of the cave and took off. Now, about 2 months later, he was in the same area hunting again, and by now it was wintertime, and it became very, very, very cold, and so he was about to. He was so cold he couldn't even pull the bow, the string on his bow. So he went back into this same cave for shelter. He built a fire and was trying to get warm. And he remembered the two rabbits he had thrown over in the corner. So he went over there, and to his surprise, the meat was still edible. It was still flexible. And what had happened is he threw them over in the corner, but they landed on a vein of salt, rock salt. And the salt had pulled the blood out of the carcass and had preserved this rabbit meat. And so he returned to the camp and told Alexander exactly what had happened. And from that time forward, Alexander began to preserve the meat that they got with salt. And it was enough for them to preserve the meat all the way to their fight in India. And so for the next few years, his army did have the meat necessary to eat before a battle took place, because of the preservation qualities of salt that they discovered strictly by accident. By now, 350 years later, salt was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity. For many years, it was a luxury. Salt was extremely expensive because it was used to preserve the meat and to preserve what the family would be eating or what the government would be eating. And so it was very expensive. But as time went on, then more salt was discovered. Rome would send conquering armies to different parts of the world, many times just for salt. An example of that is Hallstatt, Austria. When Julius Caesar sent troops up into Austria, they did it for one thing only, for one purpose only, and that was to conquer the salt mines at Hallstatt and to use those salt mines for the benefit of Rome and the preservation of their meat and their food. And so what had been a luxury now becomes a necessity. Now we see those things in our society today. Back 75, 80 years ago, a refrigerator was a luxury. If you had anything, it usually was an ice box. to keep your food cool and to preserve it. But refrigerator was something that was pretty much for the rich and the well-to-do. But now, in this society, 80, 100 years later, a refrigerator is absolutely mandatory. 20 years ago, a cell phone was something that was not even thought of as a daily necessity. If you had a cell phone, if you had a car phone, then you were of the elite, and very few people had it, and it was a luxury. But now, everybody has a cell phone, and you can't even function your day-to-day life without it. And so what was a luxury now has become a necessity. Such was the case with salt. It had now become a necessity of life. Now, the biggest and the largest area of exposed above ground salt in the world at that time was around the Dead Sea, in what is now Negev desert and around Nakaba, and all from there all the way up to the Dead Sea. Now, Augustus Caesar made an agreement with the people of Judea. They said this, that 1/2 of your tax liability you can pay with salt to be brought to Rome. And so the tax liability for money and goods was only half of what was required for them to pay, because the other half could be paid with free salt. And so the Jewish authorities and the authorities of Herod the Great would pay people to load salt into wagons and into carriages, and they would take this salt overland to the ports of Caesarea Maritima or Haifa and different places that where ships were waiting. And so the salt was loaded on these ships, and they waited until there was a caravan of ships, maybe 5 or 6 or 7, before they would go to Rome. And so they loaded the salt onto the ships, and then they covered them with a tarp or some type of covering to make sure that rain didn't hurt it, or there was no problems with the salt. But as these ships were sitting in harbor, waiting for enough to be filled to take a caravan of salt to Rome, the zealots from the Galilee, the rebels up there, whose desire was to sabotage anything that was Roman, well, they began to do their work. Under the cover of night, they would sneak in underneath the tarp or underneath the covering, and they would mix dirt in with the salt. And the Romans didn't know anything about it, and they had no idea that had happened. So now when the caravan was on its way, there would be a chemical reaction in the long journey to Rome, and the dirt would begin to interact with the salt. And by the time it got to Rome, this conglomeration of dirt and salt mixture was now worthless. It was too much salt to be any good for soil, and too much earth to be any good for salt. So many times the Roman authorities just dumped this mixture that was no good now into the sea, because of had no value whatsoever. But then Augustus Caesar came up with an idea. At that time, Rome was building roads all over the empire, and from ground zero in Rome to the furthest extents throughout the empire, roads were being built. And the Romans were excellent road builders. and there would be an area of about a foot to sometimes 2 feet deep. And then at the bottom of that ditch, they would put sand, and then crushed rock, another layer of sand, and then more crushed rock, and then larger rocks and sand again. And at the very top, you'd have paving stones, which was an excellent road. And so, but as time went on, grass began to grow up. And it grew up through the sand and through the gravel and the stone, and it began to make its way to the top of the paving stones, and it would break it open, and the paving stones would then would basically turn to chalk, and there would develop holes in the road. Augustus Caesar, he came up with an idea. He said, what we will do is that the second layer of sand, we will put this combination of salt and earth. And so they did that. They made the road with a couple of inches of this conglomeration of earth and salt. And so when the grass began to grow, it would hit that layer and die. It would not make it to the top, and it wouldn't break the paving stones apart, and the road would still be great. And even 2,000 years later, I personally have traveled on these Roman roads. This Roman road that was built 2,000 years ago is still functioning, still hauling traffic, and still connects major population centers, and the roads are still in good shape because of the idea that Augustus Caesar had concerning the salt and the earth. Jesus is telling his disciples, those ones that would be going out with him and to minister with him, he says, you can't compromise. Be either one or the other. You cannot mix the world with the preciousness of your salt. Salt is the most precious commodity that's in the world today. Such is the case with you, my disciples, and your 21st century disciples. You are most precious in the sight of God. You are a servant of Jesus. You are a fellow worker of Christ. He has chosen you to be part of his entourage as he ministers to people throughout the world. You are chosen. And you are chosen because of the value that God placed within you. You are the most precious commodity. You are the salt. But you can't mix the pleasures of the world, the downfalls of the world, in with your preciousness and with your salt. Because if you do, then there will be disaster. You'll have too much of the world to be any good for Christ, and too much of Christ to be any good for the world. Jesus told his disciples, be one or the other. Don't compromise. If you're going to be soil, then leave this group and go be your soil. But if you're going to be salt, and you're going to be precious to me and to the Heavenly Father, then don't mix the cares and the problems and the joys of this world in with your preciousness of salt. Now, that doesn't mean to become a hermit. It doesn't mean to become a monk and go hide out in a cave someplace, or go into a a facility up in the top of the Alps mountains and isolate yourself. It doesn't mean that. What it means is in daily life, okay? In daily life, if we let the cares of the world, if we can't let the activities of the world take precedent and control what we do, who we are, and what we accomplish, then that's what Jesus says must not happen. We live in this world. We have to play by the rules of this world. We were born here, we live here, and we will die here. So we are subjected to the rules, the principles, and the expectations of society and the things that we do. But we don't have to let that be our God. We don't have to let the world and the world's activities and the world's expectations to govern our lives. Instead, we are servants of the Most High God, servants of Christ, and we take that servanthood into the world, into the society that's out there, and we show by our example, we show by our witness, we show by our lack of involvement in the evils of the world. We show this world that we are not compromising, that we truly are the salt of the earth, and we are not bringing it together with the cares of the world. So be one or the other. If you're going to live for the devil, then do it. It would be the biggest mistake of your life. But you can't bring that into the worship of Jesus Christ. He wants you to be salt. He wants you to be precious. He doesn't want you to take the other route, which leads to destruction and leads to death. He wants you to stay with Him. Be His disciple. Be the precious salt. And then when you are, then you can walk with Him on the road that does not crack, does not have holes in it. And He will be with you. He will minister to you, and He will be your comfort at all times. People that we minister to in the Islamic countries, these people in the garbage city, and many others that are over there have accepted Christ. They know what we're talking about. Many of those people, when they accept Jesus, they adopt a death sentence. They will never, ever be free of this world's horrors and their imprisonment and the beatings and the torture that they go through. But they stay strong for Jesus. And many of them at the very time, at the very instant of death, or the very instant of persecution, in 1,000 different ways, they smile and say, I trust my God, and Jesus loves me, and Jesus cares, and Jesus is the only thing that I must dedicate myself to. Even in the face of death, I will trust Him. So please remember these people in prayer. They are trusting the Lord for their daily provision, for their daily life, for their daily comfort. And if you will, join many others throughout this country and throughout the world by pledging that I will pray 5 minutes a day for the persecuted believers. 182,000 died for the cause of Christ since 2016. 186,000 died for Christ. They need your prayers, not the ones that are dead, but those that are still living. They need your prayers. 5 minutes a day, pray for the persecuted believers, and the Lord will richly bless you and bless them as a result of your efforts. Thank you.
Welcome to Canaan, a small indigenous community here on the west coast of Colombia. In recent years, Canaan has grown tremendously. The people here have a heart for God and for sharing His love. This is where the Cubit Foundation does their work. Over the years, Cubit has worked on developing the community in many ways, and by doing so, they've developed personal relationships and bonds that will last a lifetime.
Cuando viene cualquier persona del extranjero, pues lo recibimos con mucho amor, recibimos con mucho aprecio, con mucho afecto, porque sabiendo que si esta persona vive tan lejos, no nos conoce y nos viene a visitar, eso para nosotros es muy satisfactorio y toca mi corazón de una manera especial.
Brad Charles is one of the leaders behind Cubit and their work in Canaan, Colombia. His passion is for helping people in need around the world and doing God's work out here on the mission field. The Cubit Foundation has done some incredible work here thus far, and God's presence is truly evident. Partnerships with local Colombian churches, Cubit has taken part in service to the village of Canaan. And with your help, Cubit will continue to serve them and many more around the world.
When people give to Cubit, I want them to go. I want them to go with me. And I want them to experience this.
Lo imposible para el hombre es posible para Dios.
To find out more and to become a part of what Cubit is doing here in Colombia, log on to cubitfoundation.org. That's cubitfoundation.org.